The Dutch have a proud history. There is a 3-meter statue of Piet Hein in Rotterdam. They call him a skilled navigator. What they mean is pirate. In 1628, Hein captured the entire Spanish treasure fleet. Spain called it piracy. The Dutch called it heroism and built monuments of him. 4 centuries later, the Dutch tried to resurrect Piet Hein's spirit, except this time, their daylight heist ended in shame and public humiliation. On the 29th of September, the United States announced the 50% rule, essentially blacklisting any company that is 50% owned by entities on U.S. sanctions lists. This immediately threatened Nexperia, a Dutch semiconductor company owned by China's Wingtech technology. The very next day, the Dutch government seized control of Nexperia under their Emergency Goods Availability Act, a law they resurrected from 1952. Their excuse? National security concerns. The timing wasn't subtle. The Dutch took their orders from Washington and executed them with the speed of a well-trained lapdog. Here's what makes this absurd. Nexperia makes legacy chips, not cutting-edge AI processors. We are talking about basic transistors and diodes that go into car headlights and steering wheels. These are 1990-era semiconductors that every developed nation can already make. But Washington wanted to contain China, and the Netherlands dutifully played along. They invoked national security to seize a company making technology older than a DVD machine. The US told them to jump, and they just asked how high. Then, China's retaliation was swift and surgical. On the 4th of October, Beijing imposed an export ban on Nexperia chips assembled in Chinese facilities, which happened to be 70% of the company's global output. The global auto industry was in panic mode. Honda, Volkswagen, Nissan, Mercedes, all warning of imminent production shutdowns. These aren't luxury components you can substitute quickly. It would take anywhere from 6 to 12 months to qualify new auto suppliers. The supply chain had been working perfectly for years. Then the Dutch seized the company, and within 4 days, the entire supply chain collapsed. The Dutch had just cut off the supply with 0 alternatives available. They created the very crisis they claimed to be preventing. And this is where the Dutch went from blundering to cruel. By mid-October, facing a disaster of their own making, they tried to start a corporate civil war. First, financial warfare. Nexperia's Dutch headquarters notified its 12,500 Chinese workers that their salaries were frozen and their system access was cut off. The colonial mindset was breathtaking. Starve the workers into submission. And it backfired instantly. Within 48 hours, Wingtech and the Chinese government stepped in, guaranteeing all wages would be paid directly by the Chinese subsidiary. The message was clear. You work for China now. Then, Nexperia China dropped the hammer. They resumed chip sales, but with a revolutionary new rule. All payments must be in Chinese yuan, not dollars. For any automaker to get these critical chips, their money now had to flow directly to China, completely bypassing the Dutch headquarters. And Beijing added the masterstroke. Exports would now be handled through case-by-case exemptions, forcing automakers to apply directly to Beijing for approval. Honda, Volkswagen, Ford, they couldn't call the Netherlands anymore. They had to get in line and plead their case with China. Then, the Dutch escalated again. Their desperation peaked when they cut off their German wafer supplies to the Chinese factory. This is but another catastrophic miscalculation. Nexperia China immediately announced it had secured alternative domestic suppliers from Shanghai for 2026 and beyond, building a completely self-sufficient supply chain within China. Every Dutch escalation only accelerated Chinese independence, hurting themselves and their EU neighbors. And while this corporate civil war raged, the real-world carnage began. Honda was forced to implement no-pay, no-penalty days at its Ohio plant, effectively paying workers not to work. Nissan warned that its production in Japan was only secure until the first week of November. The CEOs were now openly pointing fingers. Mercedes-Benz Ola Kalenius called it a politically induced situation. Ford's Jim Farley demanded a quick breakthrough to a political problem. GM and Stellantis were running 24/7 war rooms. The American Motor and Equipment Manufacturers Association warned that U.S. plants were just weeks away from catastrophic impacts. The supply chain wasn't just strained, it was snapping in real time. Just when you think the U.S. would ride to the rescue, they did the opposite. On the 30th of October, after meeting with Xi at APEC, Trump suspended the very 50% rule that triggered this entire supply chain crisis, just 31 days after announcing it. Let's be clear what happened here. The US pressured the Netherlands to commit economic suicide, then immediately backtracked on the policy that justified it, leaving their ally exposed to Chinese retaliation with zero support. That is not alliance leadership. That is throwing a pawn under the bus. By the 4th of November, China's Ministry of Commerce issued a statement blaming the Netherlands for chaos and turmoil in global supply chains, saying the Netherlands should bear full responsibility. 3 days later, on the 7th of November, just 5 weeks after the seizure, the Dutch folded. The Dutch Prime Minister announced the Netherlands would relinquish control of Nexperia. Minister Karaman's framed it as constructive dialogue with the Chinese. The rest of the world saw it for what it was, a complete surrender. Just as everyone thought the fiasco was ending, the Dutch proved they could still make things worse. China had already resumed chip exports on the 9th of November, giving the Netherlands a face-saving exit. But the Dutch headquarters kept blocking way for supplies to the Chinese factory anyway. They were still maintaining the blockade even after China had de-escalated. Then on the 12th of November, Minister Karaman's gave an interview to The Guardian where he doubled down. He would make the same decision again, calling it a wake-up call. In the same breath, he announced his officials would fly to Beijing the following week to beg for a solution. Let that sink in. "I do it again," followed immediately by "please help us fix this." The European Automobile Manufacturers Association wasn't having it. They issued another warning emphasizing that the operational problem remained Nexperia Netherlands' refusal to supply wafers, not Chinese restrictions. The Europeans were now publicly blaming the Dutch for blocking their own supply chain, after China had already reopened exports. So despite the Dutch's last-ditch effort to cope with the fact they had lost, i.e., doubling down on defiance while simultaneously flying to Beijing hat in hand, let's be clear about what actually happened here. China walked away with everything that mattered. A fully independent, yuan-based, customer-facing operation handed to them by the Dutch on a silver platter. They forced a Western government to back down publicly and demonstrated how flimsy the transatlantic alliance really is. And what did the Netherlands achieve? They seized an empty building for 5 weeks, accomplished none of their stated objectives, getting blamed internationally for the chaos they created, exposing themselves as a U.S. vassal state. The descendants of Pete Hein tried to pull off another heist in a 21st century economy. They failed. This wasn't just about one semiconductor company. It was a message to every U.S. ally. China can and will impose unbearable economic costs until your knees buckle. And when you need your American masters' support, they will be negotiating their own deals with China and leaving you to face the consequences alone. That statue of Pete Hein still stands in Rotterdam. Maybe the inscription should read, "Piracy is harder when you've been abandoned by your master, and when you're cruel enough to weaponize workers' salaries, but not strong enough to make it stick." The fiasco is still not over. Chinese media are already talking about Nexperia shifting key engineers and tech back to China, turning the Dutch headquarters into an empty shell. So what do you think happens next? Does Beijing quietly move on or hit the Netherlands with a second round of economic punishment? Drop your prediction in the comments.